America as a state has already collapsed. It's just that the American state is not aware of it yet. It's that Roadrunner thing of running off a cliff and not realizing there's nothing below your feet because you haven't looked down yet from those cartoons. That's the American state. It's already collapsed. There's no real state, and we are headed for a collapse. 2020 was proof of that. The riots of 2020. Jan 6 was an example of it, even though it was a nothing burger. It was still an example of it. To say nothing of the political polarization that the system cannot contain. This is the year we're going to start seeing the collapse of the state. We're not going to see it, maybe not fully come to fruition, but the cracks are going to be a lot bigger from this year. I'm not saying the state's going to collapse this year. I'm saying the cracks in the state are going to just be exposed way more than they ever have. But anyway, let me continue, all right? Because some neo-Nazi circles have taken note of us and our significance. And they are really pushing a counter-signaling campaign. Because I think this is what happened. At first, the feds attacked us from the left. We are the true left wing. But under a leftist disguise, that was our first major people attacking us. The feds realized that doesn't work because leftists are so irrelevant. They're just irrelevant. So now they're attacking us from the right. And maybe not us, because leftists, when leftists attack, they make it very personal. When right-wingers attack, they attack the ideology. But it's still deceptive and they're still lying. The whole thing that's being pushed, and it glows, let me tell you something with certainty. If it's not the feds that are behind the increased explosion of the Judeo-Bolshevism meme, then it's a highly organized effort by highly organized neo-Nazis. It's not a decentralized phenomenon. It's being done very intentionally and methodically, because the right wing will no longer debate me, so they're just gonna spread lies. They're spreading lies everywhere, saying that Stalin was Jewish and the Bolsheviks were Zionist, all this nonsense. They've always been anti-Jewish, but now they're giving their anti-Jewish stance, officially speaking. They're giving it an open and unambiguous anti-communist flavor. And they're making it seem like we're not gonna notice that, and we do notice it, because it exposes the true nature of the anti-Jewish campaign. When I say the anti-Jewish campaign, I'm talking about by the far right, and it's anti-communism. They're doing it to attack us. Look, the right-wingers are pretty open about this. Elon Musk likes them, and they consider this their greatest achievement. And I know Elon Musk is not the most powerful capitalist, but he is in many ways a symbol of the capitalism for a lot of people. I mean, what's the surprise? The far right is anti-communist, but I think that's finally starting to have content. The far right today is taking shape and defining itself in explicit opposition to a number of things. One is multipolarism. The far right that's emerging is defining itself in explicit opposition to multipolarism, making it actually fascistic, because in content, it's fascist. Fascism has always been about preserving the necrotic power of former elites against rising and emerging powers. Hitler made this clear, by the way, when he said, the number one crisis of Western civilization is that the colonial world is going to industrialize and we're not going to have raw materials anymore to extract from them. And he was specifically talking about the Soviet Union. This is what the menace of Bolshevism was. So the explicit anti-multipolarism, which had layers to it, the anti-BRICS, look at Milei in Argentina, how he pulled out of BRICS. So there's an anti-multipolarist orientation that's now defining a real far right. See, 2 years ago, there's no real far right. It didn't have any content. It was just ideas. Now, there are signals. Let me tell you a little bit about my information theory. In terms of information and the communication of information, there's a difference between the communication of ideologies and the communication of signals. What's the difference? In the communication of an ideology, you can communicate multiple different signals. You can have, for example, a right-wing MAGA ideology, but objectively communicate a left-wing signal, a pro-multipolar signal. We've seen this. It's very possible. Likewise, you can have a leftist ideology, but you can communicate a right-wing signal. For example, the pro-Ukraine, of course, the pro-Israel leftists. The leftists that stand in opposition to us are the most clear example of this. So the objective signal is not the same thing as the ideology. An ideology is just the consistency of a form. Remember, the idea, the etymology of idea in ancient Greece is the same as form. Idea has no regard by itself for content. So ideology is one thing, but the communication of information objectively as an objective signal, which either signals or counter signals in favor of a certain outcome or in favor of a certain orientation, or as I like to call it, polarity, because I have an electromagnetic theory of politics, so I understand in terms of real polarities. Signal is a very different thing. So what I'm trying to say is 2 years ago, there was a far right with an ambiguous and undefined orientation in terms of signal. 2 years ago, the far right was far right ideological, but in terms of signal, it's still ambiguous for the most part. Now, the far right is starting to take shape, not just in form, but also in terms of in content. And the first sign of this is the anti-multipolarist orientation in the far right. This is real fascism, by the way. That's not just fascism in the ideological sense. That's fascism in content, not just in form. So keep an eye on that. Then, second of all, the second way in which it's starting to take form through objective signals is the way the far right is beginning to define itself in opposition to MAGA communists. The major threat right now, it's not being led by personalities. That's why it's glows. It's not really personality. There's various different accounts you see, and sometimes they only have 200 followers, and they get tweets that go up to 10,000 likes, counter-signaling us. The number two thing, and this is in order of significance, is the way the far right is now taking shape, defining itself in contradistinction to MAGA communists. And I find that significant because they're not just defining themselves against blue-haired SJW leftists. They are explicitly saying, we reject class struggle. We reject the anti-capitalism. We reject the war against the ruling class. Basically, what they're saying in practice is they are willing to be the hired thugs and foot soldiers of Wall Street. They will be black shirts for Wall Street. And I know that might seem like a leap, but think about it. They have no excuse as per the terms of their self-proclaimed ideology, which they have used to deceive young people. Before, they just claimed, okay, our problem with leftists is just that they're degenerate and they're cringy and all this kind of stuff. We have restored clarity to this matter by saying Marxism-Leninism is not degenerate. It's actually profoundly conservative. And they know this now. And we've sufficiently defined what Marxism-Leninism is. Now, those elements that are now taking form, defining themselves explicitly against this, are revealing their problem with leftism is none of the things they say on the surface. It's really something ulterior. We're against degeneracy. Well, communism destroyed degeneracy. We're against the groomers. Of course, we believe in execution of groomers. We're against the woke leftists. Okay, we're not woke. Oh, we're just against people who are anti-white. Okay, we're not anti-white, right? There's no more excuses anymore to be far right. We've taken away their excuses for being far right, and we have exposed the truth of the leaders and the puppet masters behind the far right ideology, which is in Langley, Virginia. It's the feds. Who else would it be? All of the self-proclaimed justifications they made for their fascistic ideology, we have exposed it as false. So that leaves only one explanation. The real basis of the far-right ideology is in Langley, Virginia, and it's to be black shirts for Wall Street, to protect Wall Street. There is no reason anyone should be rejecting the message of communism unless you're a shill for the ruling class. Let me be clear, that's a pretty radical message. You don't have to be a communist. You don't have to agree with communism. But if you're going out of your way to counter-signal communism so much, to declare war against it, so much so to the point where you're beginning to spin lies about it, and you know you're lying too. You're lying methodically and deliberately. The only reason why you would be doing that is if you serve the ruling class. There's no other fucking reason. There is no other reason why anyone would be actively anti-communist. Actively. Remember, I don't say passively. Only a small percentage of people will ever be communists with a capital C. In China, 10% are members of the Communist Party. Even in China, which is a communist country. So we're not saying you have to be a communist. But if you are creating an ideology based on attacking us, put it this way, forget about the labels. Anyone who is counter-signaling us is a fucking fed or a retard. But to be a retard, you can't be that organized. So you're a fed. Get what I'm saying? A retard is not so highly organized. A retard is not so methodical and calculating. So you're a f***ing fed. Straight up. We know who the retards are. The retards are the ones who moan and bitch and cry and nothing else. But feds are the ones that spin lies methodically and with a calculating intention. That's a fed. Only a fed can do this. So let's be clear about what's going on. The right wing are not anti-Zionist. Let's be clear. And now we're talking about the right wing in terms of the real content. Because guess what, guys? The political spectrum has been reset. If you were a right winger 2 or 3 years ago, you don't know what you are right now. If you were a leftist 2 or 3 years ago, maybe you're still a leftist. But even then, everything's up in the air now. But now a left wing and a right wing have taken form. And the left wing is represented by Infrared, by Jackson Hinkle, by George Galloway, by people like us, Jimmy Dore, I would argue. This is the objective left wing that has emerged. And I'm missing a lot of names, of course, but there's an objective left wing that has emerged. And now there's an objective right wing. Now, where does that leave leftists? Some leftists are getting with the program and understanding what's going on. But for the most part, leftists are what you call fence sitters or fascist collaborators, because that's the role they're fulfilling. Leftists are increasingly starting to become left comms. Have you ever noticed that phenomena? All the Maoists are now becoming left comms. You're going to start seeing more of that because the pipeline, can I explain to you guys the pipeline to fascism, fascist ideology? It always goes leftist, left comm, Mussolini fascist to Hitler fascist. Literally, it's 4 stages. The 4 stages is leftist, left comm, Mussolini fascist to Hitler fascist. These are the 4 stages which await leftists. The stage to infrared is simple. If you're a leftist, what's the pipeline to infrared? The pipeline is leftist to multipolarist to infrared. It's 2 steps. That's it. I shouldn't say infrared. I should say communist. The stages to, if you're starting as a leftist, the only pipeline available to you is leftist, multipolarist, to communist with a capital C. That's it. That's only a small minority of leftists, I think, not the majority. And then people are saying, Haas, doesn't that exclude all the white people? Because the primary motivation of white people is not multipolarism. And then I say, but here's the issue. Most white leftists will never accept infrared. Some white straight males, maybe, but if they're like autistic or if they're like nerds, maybe there's a pipeline there. I don't know, but it's much less likely. The white people who come around to infrared usually start out right wing. And in fact, in the American context, we consider them extremely important. Put it this way, the white leftists tend to be the weaker seed. And then the far right, who are so knee-deep into it, those are also weak seed. I'm not saying we want center-left or I'm not saying this center-right, God forbid. We're not talking about TPUSA, but we've made no secret of the fact that we think there is potential to disseminate communistic consciousness among white people who just vaguely have libertarian sentiments. I'm not talking about libertarian ideology. I'm talking about anti-government sentiment, period, which is oftentimes expressed in libertarian ideology. But it doesn't mean we support libertarian ideology like Millet. It just means that this ambiguous, vague anti-government sentiment is much more amicable to becoming a revolutionary consciousness than a university grad student, a Democrat intern who is loyal to the system but just wants to make some reforms to it. Hegemony versus being outside hegemony. Ideology and objective signal are very different things, but that's always been our stance. What about Christian conservatives? Of course, I think that falls under, I don't mean libertarian in the sense of like just to being a cringe, socially liberal. I'm not talking about that. I mean salt of the earth, anti-government communities and people, specifically rural. Of course, yes, who are Christian. Absolutely, that's a given. I think there's a difference between us and the far right when it comes to Christianity. We actually do believe that communism is in line with the Bible, in line with Jesus. And if you're Christian, if you're in our community and you're Christian, you genuinely believe that communism is Christian in essence. But the far right uses Christianity as a tool. What is Christian in content about Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy? What is Christian about that specific political formation. Nothing. It's clearly pagan in content. So we understand there's been issues between communism and religion. Formally, yes. But in content, which one is closest to Christianity? Of course, communism is, because the fascists admitted it. The Nazis said that Bolshevism was Christianity. The menace was the Christian Bolshevik, the Judeo-Christian. That's what they would call it. The Judaizing Christian influence they wanted to eliminate. So these far-right people, they are using Christianity very cynically. They don't actually believe it. It's not based on belief. It's using it as a tool. We are a Christian in content. Again, religion in form and content are not the same. It's always been the issue of all religions, the incongruity between the content and the form. How are communist Christians in content? Good question. I would put it this way. The logic of, originally speaking at least, proletarian consciousness is a Christological logic. Because Jesus Christ in Christianity is the unity of the universal and the particular, that has the same role afforded to the status of the proletariat. But it's not to say the proletariat is Jesus, it's to say the conception of the class struggle is a Christological type of logic. So that's not even beginning with Lenin's, which I've talked about before, Lenin's element of Christ-like forgiveness that led him to look at the Russian countryside as the ground zero of class struggle. Forgiveness of the imperfection of form, so to speak. Again, Christological. That's my easiest summary of the matter. I could also just talk about how communism has its very direct origin in the wars following the Reformation, like the Peasants' War in Germany, and Engels' description of Christianity in the early Christianity in the late 1890s, where he describes it as communistic, literally, in practice. I mean, literally, the first Christians were communistic. They also championed debt relief and debt forgiveness as a fundamental demand and interpretation of Jesus. So that was literally the case. But in the more kind of metaphysical sense, how is communism Christian in content? It's simple. The conception of humanity and the social realm that accompanies communist consciousness is Christian in nature. It applies Christianity to a sphere that it had never been applied to before. Of course, you can also listen to just what the Nazis said. The Nazis would say the universalism and notion of universal brotherhood and universal salvation and good news of the Bolsheviks is the same as the Christianity, both Judaizing, corrupting elements. That's what they said directly. So that's how I would put it.